So, when you think about the great empires of history, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's this picture of just unstoppable power, right? These huge territories colored in on a map during an age of massive global expansion.
Yeah, this quote kind of nails it. We picture them as these giant blobs on a map, just rolling over everything. It's an image of complete authority, power so absolute that you'd think everyone just accepted it without a fight.
But here's the thing. Was that really the case? History is absolutely packed with moments where that power just hits a brick wall. So, were they actually unstoppable? The answer, as we're about to see, is a huge no. You know, power is almost never accepted without a fight.
We're going to be focusing on the period from 1450 to 1750, a time of just incredible imperial growth around the world. But here's the crucial part. As these states tried to expand, they were met with fierce pushback, and not just from the people they were conquering, but from right inside their own borders. And this resistance was happening everywhere. I mean, from indigenous uprisings in the Americas like the Pueblo Revolt, to nobles rebelling against their own king in France with the Fronde, and even these massive power shifts in India with the Marathas. It was this constant global tug-of-war between expansion and defiance.
So let's take a little global tour of this defiance. As these empires got bigger and tried to tighten their grip, they put this immense pressure on local communities. And people, well, they felt crushed, so they pushed back. Let's see how they did it.
A really dramatic and honestly powerful example comes from North America and what we now call the southwestern United States. The Pueblo people there were facing just intense pressure from Spanish colonizers.
And look, this wasn't about just one thing. It was this perfect storm of forced labor, horrible new diseases wiping people out, and this intense religious pressure to convert. Then, in 1680, a leader named Pape managed to channel all that desperation into a coordinated revolt that did the unthinkable. It actually kicked the Spanish completely out of their territory for more than a decade. It just goes to show you how vulnerable even a mighty empire could be when faced with a unified local resistance.
Okay, now let's hop across the Atlantic to France for a totally different kind of challenge. Here, the threat wasn't some outside force. No, the Fronde was an internal rebellion aimed right at the growing, centralizing power of the French monarchy itself. So you've got the famous Sun King, Louis XIV, and he's pulling power away from the traditional nobles. You combine that with sky-high taxes to pay for his wars, and you've got a recipe for disaster. The nobles, who felt their influence just slipping away, sparked these uprisings, and the peasants who were getting crushed by taxes joined in. But here's the crazy, ironic twist. The rebellion totally failed. And its failure actually allowed Louis to consolidate his power even more, strengthening the very absolutism they were trying to fight.
This table really lays out the wild spectrum of outcomes. Just look at that final outcome column. In places like France and Russia, the rebellions were crushed, and it actually led to stronger state control. But then you've got the Marathas in India. Their strategy of sustained, decades-long guerrilla warfare was perfectly designed to wear down a big, centralized empire. It was a completely different tactic from the spontaneous uprisings in Europe. And it didn't just resist the Mughal Empire, it fundamentally weakened it and caused a massive power shift. It just proves the point. The outcome of resistance was never guaranteed.
All right, our journey now takes us to West Central Africa, to modern-day Angola, for an incredible story of leadership. Queen Zinga was facing the aggressive expansion of the Portuguese, who were, of course, deeply involved in the horrific slave trade in the region. Queen Zinga was an absolutely brilliant political and military leader. She didn't just fight, she was smart. She formed strategic alliances with Portuguese rivals like the Dutch. Using this amazing combination of sharp diplomacy and personally leading her armies into battle, she managed to hold off Portuguese domination for decades. It's just a remarkable example of effective, sustained leadership against a major European power.
Now, let's head back to North America for our last example in this section. And this one, well, it has a really tragic outcome. You might know it as King Philip's War. It was a brutal, bloody clash between indigenous peoples and English colonists in New England, and it was all fueled by the colonists constantly pushing onto native lands. Metacom, a leader the English called King Philip, managed to build this incredible alliance of several native groups to fight back. And at first they were actually winning. They won significant victories and caused widespread panic among the colonists. But in the end, the colonists just had more people and more resources.
The alliance was defeated, Metacom was killed, and the war led to the utter devastation of native communities. It basically broke organized indigenous resistance in that part of the world for good.
And that brings us to another absolutely crucial kind of resistance. I mean, the entire colonial project in the Americas was built on the backs of millions of enslaved Africans. But these people were not passive victims, not at all. They resisted constantly, in ways that challenged the very core of this inhumane system.
One of the most amazing forms of this resistance was the creation of what are called Maroon societies. So, what were they? These were communities formed by enslaved people who managed to escape. They fled deep into the mountains or swamps, places where they would be hard to find, and they built their own independent towns. They were, literally, free societies thriving right in the middle of slave territories. And just stop and think for a second about what this took. First, the incredible courage just to escape the plantation. Then, a dangerous journey to find a safe place. After that, all the hard work of building a new community from absolutely nothing. And finally, you had to constantly defend it, because the colonial powers were always sending militias to try and destroy these powerful symbols of freedom.
And get this, sometimes they were astonishingly successful. In Jamaica, the British spent decades trying and failing to crush the Maroon communities. Their resistance was so fierce, so effective, that in 1739, the British Empire, one of the most powerful forces on Earth, was forced to sign a treaty that formally recognized the freedom and autonomy of the Maroons. They literally fought a global superpower to a draw.
So the Maroons show us one strategy: escape to build a separate society. But the Stono Rebellion, which, believe it or not, happened in the very same year, 1739, represents a whole different playbook: direct, violent uprising. In South Carolina, a group of enslaved people seized weapons and started a desperate march towards Spanish Florida, where they believed they could find freedom.
Now, the rebellion was ultimately and brutally crushed by the local militia, but its impact, it was huge. It sent absolute shockwaves of fear through the slaveholding colonies. So even though it failed, it was this terrifying reminder to enslavers that enslaved people could and would rise up. The immediate response was to pass even harsher laws. But that spirit of resistance, that fundamental challenge to the system, could never really be put out.
So as we start to wrap this up, we've seen these two major streams of resistance, right? You have local populations pushing back against state control, and you have enslaved people challenging the very foundation of the whole colonial system. So what's the big takeaway from all this?
Well, what's really clear is just how diverse the outcomes were. You can see the breakdown right here. While about half were eventually crushed, a lot of them achieved temporary success, and a crucial few, like the Marathas, led to a major, lasting shift in power. There was no single story.
So, the key things to remember are pretty simple. First, pushback against growing state power during this time was constant, and it was happening all over the globe. Second, people resisted for all sorts of reasons: colonization, taxes, loss of rights. Third, enslaved people fought back relentlessly through both escape and uprising. And finally, the methods they used and the results they got were incredibly diverse, all shaped by local factors, which makes every story unique.
And that all leads us to one final thought to leave you with. When you look at this incredible variety of successes and failures, what do you think really made the difference? What factors? Was it leadership, tactics, geography, or just timing? What determines whether a challenge to state power actually has a lasting impact? It's a huge question, and its echoes are still really relevant today.